this.
It's the world serpent.
There's a very particular formula that the God of War series has followed since its original release in 2005. It's been one of fast-paced hack-and-slash action with a healthy dose of big boss battles, quick-time events, and brutal bloody combat. That story was centered around vengeance, with Kratos seeking revenge for the deaths of his wife and daughter. If you haven't played those games, spoiler alert, Kratos gets the revenge he sought. He rampaged through the gods of Greek mythology, killing all that stood before him on his way to the summit of Mount Olympus. In retrospect, they truly are some of the best action games of all time. In each game, Sony Santa Monica managed to capture the imagination with the scope of these fabled gods and monsters, and killing them was the ultimate power fantasy. While many thought that the series had been put to bed after the climax in God of War 3, God of War Ascension, a prequel, released to far less fanfare than the previous games, and it was unclear where Sony Santa Monica could go after that. What was clear was that they couldn't just keep going back to the same well. They had told a complete story, and how much more could they possibly tell around this central narrative? Where do you go after you've killed all the gods? Apparently you start over anew with God of War. You move Kratos to a new land, with a new cast of ruling deities. This main character has changed, and some time has passed. He's older and wiser. He's seemingly put his past behind him, or at least tried to. He's found peace, married again, and had a son. Unfortunately though, tragedy is never far behind him. While the new God of War never gives you the glimpse of the going-ons between God of War 3 to the present, the game begins with Kratos in mourning of his new wife's passing. He and his son Atreus are preparing for a trip to bring his wife's ashes to the highest point of the Norse lands. The problem they encounter is that the gods of this new realm don't take kindly to another god encroaching on their turf, and they'll do everything they possibly can to stop the father and son from reaching their ultimate destination. Of course, there are plenty of twists and turns, interesting characters, and great moments in this game, and for God of War fans, they are simply best experienced by playing. So we're going to leave it at that. More broadly, God of War is a hard pivot to something more mature, something where Sony Santa Monica explores the character of Kratos on a deeper level than has been touched on in previous games. He is different in this new God of War. He's a father, a teacher, a role model. It's a somber story, with the main goal being to fulfill your wife's dying wish. Everything else just seems to orbit around this, and while that might sound like somewhat of a boring premise, the adventure is anything but. God of War has incredible high peaks of action-packed moments and calmer, more reflective periods. For fans of the series, there's just enough resolution to give you satisfaction, yet there's just enough tease to let you know that there's more story to tell here. What it all boils down to is a game that feels more mature, casting a wider net, telling a story that God of War fans can appreciate, while others can relate to. While previous games focused on the power fantasy and rage of Kratos, the addition of Atreus into the game alters the narrative tone, but there are gameplay implications as well. Combat has always been front and center in the God of War series, with Kratos slinging around the blades of chaos and using quick-time events for what felt like big, cinematic moments in every battle. A lot has changed here. There are less quick-time events. Combat has a more deliberate feel to it, and there's a lot more exploration and light puzzle solving. In almost every aspect, the new God of War has been touched up and modernized, but not straying too far away from the previous games to make it unrecognizable, though strong moves in new directions nonetheless. On the combat side, Kratos has traded in his trademark blades for a more setting-suitable melee weapon called the Leviathan Axe. He'll use this in combination with a shield, fist, rage powers, and fancy footwork while in battle. He's also got Atreus in tow, who is a capable AI companion when it comes to fighting. Atreus moves around the world controlled by the computer, but the player does control when he shoots his bow and arrow as an attack. Putting all these things together, and you've got a combat system in the new God of War that feels entirely different than previous games. When you add that to the tighter, over-the-shoulder view, there's a pretty big shift in both the way the combat looks and plays. Battles are more up close and personal, with Kratos needing to pick his dodging and blocking spots accordingly. throwing in rolls, parries, and finishing moves as the opportunities present themselves, while also utilizing Atreus' skill with the bow and arrow to soften up enemies. The Leviathan Axe is something completely different from other weapons that Kratos has used, and it really changes the flow of combat. Kratos can wield the axe as a melee weapon or use its projectile function. You can whip the axe at enemies and then recall it back to you. It's an undeniably cool mechanic. Combat is a mixture of old school God of War and modern action RPGs. It's easy to learn, but has enough depth to it that allows you to become better over time, and ultimately more powerful throughout the course of the game, or successive playthroughs on higher difficulty levels. These same weapons that Kratos and his son use to take down enemies are used to navigate the world, complete puzzles, and find item caches that help you along your way. The Leviathan Axe is certainly fun to toss at enemies, but it's also used in many environmental puzzles in the game. As it has a freezing capability when thrown, it can be used to freeze levers in place or clear paths through hazardous areas. As Atreus grows, so do his skills with the bow and arrow. He'll learn a handful of abilities that allow the pair to go places they previously couldn't, through the use of different arrow types that can create bridges or blow up certain types of barriers. Being that this game is non-linear, there are many places that are technically reachable at the early parts of the game that can't be accessed until certain skills are learned. If there's a single complaint that we can levy against the core combat and exploration in God of War, it isn't because of what's been changed. The new system is fun and more challenging than the older games. Where it does fall short, possibly, is in the boss battles that you'll encounter. Sure, this new God of War has its fair share of big moments, but they feel a little less impactful than they were in previous games. Nevertheless, some of the biggest moments in the game do ultimately fall somewhat flat, if only when comparing them to previous games. What we've come to expect from God of War is fights with massive bosses, and Sony Santa Monica does a lot of recycling here, with troll bosses standing in for the more iconic gods or monsters. These mini-bosses feel like they're overused just a little bit too much, and you'll encounter them numerous times throughout the game. While they have unique attacks, features, and names, they all look somewhat similar to one another. Other than varying elemental attacks, these battles also end in roughly the same manner, with Kratos slamming a giant rock slab on them for the finishing blow. With quick-time events being far less prevalent in previous games, it would have been nice to see a little bit more variety here when they do pop up. The same can be said of a number of different enemy types and the finishing moves that Kratos uses to deliver these final blows. Typically, these moments were where you saw the brutality and anger of the character as he ripped the monster's head off of its body or popped its eye out of socket. The game still features this brutal violence, but it really feels boiled down into a handful of animations that you'll likely see many times throughout the course of the game. And perhaps we're overstating this a bit. These enemies simply aren't one size fits all. They have levels and weaknesses associated with them, so fighting just a single enemy can be a long dance of using all the aforementioned tools. To tackle the toughest of them, you'll need to be working to improve your skills, leveling through skill trees for each of the characters. Kratos can level his weapons, rage attacks, and shield attacks, while Atreus can level his attacking skill as a whole. These levels are somewhat gated by the loot system in the game, in which you find items that allow you to level weapons. There is a lot more exploration in this God of War game than any before it. You're constantly tracking down treasures, things like in-game currency, gems that can be socketed into weapons, or items that allow you to increase your health and rage meters. Each area of the game has numerous treasures to hunt down or environmental puzzles to solve, and it's really up to you in terms of how much or how little you want to track off the main path. This exploration is a big part of the game as it leads to new items and loadout possibilities, but it can be a little overwhelming at times as there's no linear path to a most powerful character. While your weapon selection in itself is slim, there's a variety of different ways to customize Kratos and Atreus in gems that are socketed into their weapons and armor. Two of the main characters that you'll meet in the game early on are a pair of blacksmith brothers who will craft you powerful armor in a number of different categories for chest, wrist, waist, pommels, and talismans. You can also upgrade your armor or purchase new pieces outright. The system in place here is pretty deep when compared to previous games in the series, and I think it adds to the game in meaningful ways that make you want to get out and explore the world to find this new equipment. This expansion for the loot system goes hand in hand with the quasi-open world elements that the new God of War features. It's not a true open world like, say, Assassin's Creed, for example, There's a hub called the Lake of the Nine, which serves as a starting point for most adventures, as it's a place that features numerous tributaries that can be explored and also holds a portal which can be used to access different realms. You'll hit most of these spots across the course of the story, but there's plenty that you won't uncover unless you do some exploring. If this doesn't sound like the God of War that you remember, that's because it's really not. This is a new God of War that features many of the different trappings of more modern games with all the loot, progression, and exploration that are stuffed into them. That said, all of these things don't feel shoehorned into the new God of War either. In fact, after the credits rolled, I felt like I had only seen a sliver of what the game had to offer in terms of items to unlock and secrets to find. You do have the ability to go back into the game and explore at will, and I'm glad I did. There's many things to find, including a challenge arena, a host of Valkyrie fights, and a bunch of side content that really can give you a better understanding of the world. While there are some NPC nags that you'll encounter throughout the story that poke you in the direction of checking out this content, I would have liked to experience more of this before getting to the end of the game, where it's less meaningful. Where God of War does feel familiar is in its presentation. This game is an absolute beauty on the PlayStation 4, there's a gorgeous art style to it, and it features some of the very best visuals we've seen on the platform. God of War has always been about these larger-than-life moments that present a sense of scale to the player that just blows you away. At least that's always been my takeaway. There was always this sense in the older games that you were persevering through the grunt combat to get to that massive, beautiful bookend boss. This game doesn't have quite the same pace as previous God of War games, but the big moments are still very much here, and when they are, they're just as amazing as ever. Sure, it's kind of hard to top some of the things that we've seen from this series, but the new God of War manages to sneak in its own big moments, even if it's with lesser known figures. Needless to say, God of War has a very high bar of quality expectations to live up to. For the most part, Sony Santa Monica has succeeded. The art direction of the game is absolutely incredible, and while there have been a bunch of great looking games on the PlayStation 4 so far, this is definitely right up there with the very best we've seen on the platform. For those looking for an even deeper immersive experience, you can turn off display elements in the game to take in the experience without monster levels, health meters, threat indicators, or world compass. Either way, God of War is a great looking, more often than not, jaw-dropping game from a presentation standpoint. It's hard to imagine a God of War fan not enjoying this, for all the reasons that we did mention and some that we're holding back for the sake of spoilers. Even though it has seen considerable changes from previous games in the series, they almost all feel like they've been for the better. It's a bigger, better looking game than any in the series. The tone is a welcome change that allows us to see a side of Kratos that hasn't been seen before, while at the same time introducing us to a brand new world. There are countless hours to spend on the single player campaign, and there's a ton of stuff to keep you busy on the side. Regardless, the next chapter in the life of Kratos seems like it's going to be just as interesting as his younger years.